Did Christopher Columbus discover a new world, or did he destroy one? It's a pretty heavy question, right? But it really challenges that sanitized, almost fairy tale narrative of exploration we've all been taught. Because the true history of the Americas, well, it's far darker, way more complex, and honestly a lot more tragic than just a simple tale of a brave sailor crossing the ocean blue.
8 million. Think about that number for a second. That is the staggering human death toll on the island of Hispaniola alone, just in the years right after European contact. 8 million people wiped out. To really understand the terrifying gravity of how this happened, we actually have to go all the way back to the very beginning.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the epic and deeply tragic scope of the history of the Americas. We're looking at an era that some historians unflinchingly call the American Holocaust. We're going to trace the origins of the New World, starting with ancient Ice Age hunters and going all the way to the ashes that ultimately paved the way for English colonization. Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, two worlds kept apart. Then, Europe's desperate Asian quest, followed by Columbus and the Grand Mistake. Next, we'll look at the American Holocaust, the fall of the great empires, and finally, the seeds of a nation. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. Two worlds kept apart. To really grasp this story, we have to jump way back, about 25,000 years ago. That's when Siberian hunters crossed an icy land bridge over the Bering Strait, stepping into the Americas. But about 11,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended. The sea levels rose, and poof, that bridge vanished entirely. What followed is just this incredible geographic irony. For millennia, these two massive landmasses developed completely independently. Both the Old World and the New World eventually grew to have roughly 50 million people each. But here's the kicker. Neither side had absolutely any idea the other existed.
And the New World? It was definitely not some empty, untouched wilderness. Just look at the sheer scale of the civilizations here. You had the Aztecs in modern-day Mexico, boasting 6 million people and engineering these unbelievable floating gardens. You had the ancient Mayans, with millions of citizens and a highly advanced culture. And stretching way down the Andes was the massive Inca Empire, home to 12 million people. These were immense, thriving, complex societies.
Which brings us to Section 2, Europe's desperate Asian quest.
Meanwhile, across that seemingly impassable ocean, 15th century Europe was experiencing a profound crisis of its own, a crisis that would eventually change the fate of those American empires forever. It all traces back to one monumental event, the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. This single military defeat completely blocked Europe's crucial land trade routes to Asia. And the result? A massive economic collapse. We're talking harrowing scenes here. Mass poverty, starvation, spiraling crime rates. It was absolute desperation. And that desperation is exactly what forced European monarchs to start seeking out really dangerous, completely untested new sea routes to Asia. Honestly, just to survive.
Moving on to Section 3, Columbus and the Grand Mistake.
Enter Christopher Columbus. Now, historical lore usually paints him as this grand visionary, right? But in reality, he was an average sailor with a heavily flawed mathematical pitch. He was completely obsessed with Marco Polo's exaggerated travel journals, specifically regarding a place called Cipango, which is the historical name for Japan. Marco Polo falsely described Cipango as an island practically dripping in wealth, with palaces literally roofed in solid gold. So consumed by these delusions, Columbus pitched a totally incorrect idea to Spain, claiming that by sailing west, he could find a quick shortcut to all that gold.
Which brings us to the number 36. That is how many agonizing days Columbus and his crew spent sailing into the absolute unknown in 1492. Supplies were dwindling, the crew was starving, they were paranoid, and they were right on the brink of a violent mutiny. They were quite literally ready to throw Columbus overboard. But finally, after 36 days, they spotted land. Of course, it wasn't Japan, it was the modern-day Bahamas.
That takes us to Section 4, the American Holocaust.
When Columbus landed, he encountered native populations who had lived in peace for millennia. These are people with absolutely no concept of private property or iron weapons. But still believing he was somewhere near Asia, Columbus became dangerously obsessed with finding gold. Gold that simply wasn't there. So he and his brothers implemented horrific forced labor policies on Hispaniola. Every native over the age of 14 was forced to meet impossible gold quotas every 3 months. And if they failed, their hands were amputated. Natives were worked to death in mines, leading to massive death tolls from pure exhaustion and starvation.
The cruelty actually reached such extremes that entire communities consumed toxic cassava poison to commit mass suicide, just to escape living in slavery.
Columbus quickly transitioned from an explorer to a brutal tyrant, and this reality is chillingly captured by Hattuey, a tribal chief who tried to resist. When Hattuey was captured and tied to a stake to be burned alive, a Spanish priest offered to baptize him so his soul could go to heaven. Hattuey paused and asked the priest if the Spanish went to heaven. When the priest said yes, Hattuey delivered this incredibly powerful final thought. He said, "If heaven is where Christians go, I prefer hell."
Section 5. The Fall of the Great Empires.
This devastation quickly spread to the mainland. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico. He had just about 600 men with him. And the Aztec Empire he was facing? 6 million people. It is an absurdly asymmetrical scenario. So you have to ask yourself, how in the world did a force of 600 defeat millions?
Well, it really came down to superstition, trickery, and biology. First off, Emperor Montezuma fatally hesitated. Aztec mythology actually spoke of a returning god, and the Spanish, arriving on these massive ships with strange animals, happened to fit the description. This hesitation allowed Cortés to basically walk right into the capital, take Montezuma hostage, and loot the city. Now, the Aztecs did fight back, temporarily pushing the Spanish out, but the conquistadors left behind an invisible, absolutely devastating weapon: smallpox. With zero natural immunity, hundreds of thousands of Aztecs died within just months. It completely broke their ability to defend themselves.
And the asymmetry was even more shocking further south. Francisco Pizarro invaded the Inca Empire, a thriving civilization of 12 million people, with just 180 men. Again, it wasn't brute force, it was ruthless deception. Pizarro invited the Inca emperor, Atahualpa, to a so-called peaceful meeting. When the emperor arrived with 5,000 unarmed attendants, Pizarro's men ambushed them. They slaughtered all 5,000 people in just 1 hour and took the emperor hostage.
Desperate for his life, Emperor Atahualpa offered an astonishing ransom. He promised to fill an entire room to the brim with solid gold. Pizarro agreed. The Incas actually delivered this unimaginable wealth. But instead of releasing him, Pizarro just took the gold, put the emperor on a mock trial, and had him strangled to death anyway. It proved, pretty conclusively, that absolutely no amount of wealth could satisfy the conquerors. With that, the great empires of the Americas had officially fallen.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 6, the Seeds of a Nation.
With the massive native empires entirely dismantled, the wealth of a shattered world flowed back across the ocean. And this paved the way for a whole new wave of opportunists. Just think about this brutal chain of cause and effect for a second. In 11,000 BC, the ice melts, dividing the worlds. Jump to 1492, an economic crisis pushes Columbus to stumble into the Bahamas. By 1521, the mighty Aztecs fall to disease and deception, clearing the land, which directly leads us to the final date on our timeline here, 1607.
In 1607, a tiny group of just 104 Englishmen arrived in the territory we now know as Virginia to build Jamestown. This marked a major shift. The era of Spanish plundering was fading, and the era of English settling was beginning. But it is absolutely vital to remember that this modest English arrival, the one that would eventually grow into the United States of America, was built upon the ruins and the ashes of the tens of millions of indigenous people who came before them.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to ponder. Knowing this brutal, undeniable chain of historical events, how should we view the foundational history of the world's most powerful superpower today? You see, the past isn't just a list of dates and names. It's a profound and sometimes deeply uncomfortable story of cause and effect that permanently shapes our modern world. Thanks for tuning into this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning everything, and we'll catch you next time.